We are going to be joined today by 4 people who know much more about this issue than I ever will. 4 experts, each slightly specializing in different areas, and so I'm looking forward to a very, very fruitful discussion. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, if you have a question that you would like me to present to the panelists, please send it to us that online, and we will make a maximum effort, time permitting, to have your question asked. Once again, welcome all. With your permission, I'll introduce our very illustrious panel. Professor Umut Uzer is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at Istanbul Technical University. He's the author of 2 books, An Intellectual History of Turkish Nationalism, 2016, and Identity and Turkish Foreign Policy, 2011. Professor, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Dr. Asli Aksoy is the deputy head of the Center for Applied Turkish Studies, CATS, at the German Institute for Security and International Affairs, SWP. Her work at CATS focuses on democratization and authoritarianization and international affairs, processes within civil society in Turkey, the Kurdish questions, and gender and politics. We are so pleased to have you with us, especially as we know that you also analyze Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, which is, of course, what we're discussing here today. Dr. Selin Nasi is the London representative of the Ankara Policy Centre. She's also a regular columnist for Politikol and the Anchor news agency's weekly newsletter for English readers, Anchor Review. Nasi received her PhD in political science and international relations from the, I probably mispronounced it and I apologize, from the Boğaziçi University, and her doctoral thesis was on Turkey's attitude, its policies towards Israel during the Cold War. And finally, my colleague here at the INSS, Remy Daniel, he's a Neubauer Research Associate at the INSS and a PhD candidate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's focusing in his research on Turkish-Israel relations during the Turkish Second Republic. Welcome to you all. We are honored by your participation in this special web event. May I start and get the ball rolling by asking the first question to Professor Uzer. Professor Uzer, from a historic perspective of the bilateral relations, how much was the crisis in Turkish-Israel relations that we have seen over the past decade, the bad relationships, how much was that a divergence from the previous period, and what should be or what is the norm in Israel-Turkish relations?
Well, thank you, Mr. Regev. So I think it was a divergence from the traditional positive relations between the 2 countries. I mean, no doubt there were ups and downs in the bilateral relationship over the decades. Well, if you look to certain facts, in fact, turning points, such as Turkey's recognition of the State of Israel in March 1949, so less than a year, in 10 months after it was declared as an independent state. So that is pretty early, I would argue. Number 2, the existence of the Periphery Pact, Israel's sort of secret alliance between Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia and other non-Arab elements in the Middle East. So that made the strategic dimension, yes, secret, but still it was a background on which I think the golden age of the 1990s, which had the strategic elements for military, strategic, economic, cultural, touristic, educational, all these elements we lived through in the 1990s. So when we look at the 1990s, we can also ask the question, was that the exception? And I would argue the 1990s, the golden age, yes, it was, the intensity was much stronger, no doubt, but I think the 1990s was based on a very solid strategic and intelligence cooperation going back to the Periphery Pact. I mean, it wasn't, of course, continuous. There were, divergences. There were certain downgradings, no doubt. But we have to keep in mind that Turkey never closed down its embassy after it opened it in the 1950s. Yes, there were elements of downgrading the representation, like we don't have an ambassador in Tel Aviv, no doubt. But still, the downgrading doesn't mean, closing off the embassy. Whereas the Turkish Consulate General in East Jerusalem was closed in 1980 as a reaction to the Jerusalem Law of 1980, reopened, only to be reopened in 1992. That is something important, and I believe it was an exception in the sense that yes, the relations were not great, but they were solid enough, sometimes secret, and the trade seems to be going on, that's no doubt, but I think it was the exception. So is it possible to reset the relationship, normalize again? I think that is what the two countries are trying to do, because that is the common sense, that is the rational thing to do, because we've been saying this for many years. Academics, certain journalists, and certain former diplomats are saying this, and would be in the best interest of both countries. I can keep on, but it's probably best to keep short.
I agree. That way we have more of a conversation and a free flow. I will not give long speeches myself. I would just remind you, or Professor Uzar, I remember myself when I joined the Israeli Foreign Service in 1991. We used to hold up our relations with Turkey as an example of how the Jewish state can have a very positive relationship with a Muslim majority country. It was the example that we wanted to show the whole world. But of course, as you said quite correctly, that was the golden age. Dr. Nasi, with your permission, I'd like to ask you. You're an expert on public opinion in Turkey. How did public opinion in Turkey deal with the crisis over the last decade? Was it at all interested? Maybe we're a peripheral in Turkish public opinion.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. And Ambassador Recep, I don't know if you remember, but we met when I first relocated to London. Before you left London, yes. I had the honor to meet you. So it's so good to see you again. Well, looking at the visit and how the media attention is, how the visit receives media attention, I can say that the media and the public opinion is almost looking for a happy ending here. And one explanation for this might be that Turkey's restoration of ties with Israel, just like Umut said, is considered a rational and perhaps a belated step that will benefit the country. The media, therefore, is following the events very closely. Another explanation, and perhaps a more plausible one, especially when you think of the pro-government media's enthusiasm in the last couple of months, is perhaps to prepare the public opinion for the government's foreign policy U-turn. Because as you all know, Israel has been portrayed very negatively in the Turkish media for quite a while. And the leaders of both countries, until a short while ago, were verbally attacking each other every now and then. And both leaders have used bilateral disagreements for domestic political games to mobilize their constituency. So it takes time to adjust to the new reality on the ground, I reckon. On the other hand, the opposition takes pleasure in confronting the government over its policy backtracking. It is interesting because no one really dares to talk about what we have gained since 2018 or what we have achieved with regard to the Palestinian issue, for example. Why did we side with the Muslim Brotherhood so blindly? Or why did we insist on staying the course when the power dynamics were already changing? Unfortunately, our foreign policy missteps created a power vacuum which only benefited our rivals. On the upside, Turkish policymakers have also acknowledged this fact, so that they have embarked on a diplomatic campaign to restore Turkey's ties with countries in the region. That's because geopolitical imperatives dictate so. Even if these policymakers still have the same ideological perspective as before. Unfortunately, we don't have a healthy environment to discuss these issues. Foreign policymakers just simply say we should move on, and we do. But in order to build healthy relations, I think we need to give an account of what happened in the first place. I tried to talk about the media's attention, but one last thing about public perceptions. Based on the Kadir Has University's annual survey of Turkey trends, I can say that unfortunately not much has changed. I'm very curious about the results that will come out next year, but Israel is still seen one of the three biggest threats to Turkey's security. This is not surprising, given the fact that, given the anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli content that has been circulating in the Turkish media for several years, which is often ignored by the government in the name of free speech. Also, traditionally, you can find anti-Israeli sentiment among both the political right and political left for various other reasons. But in general, the antipathy towards Israel stems from Israel's treatment of Palestinians. So unless we see a slight bit of change there, the negative attitude will remain, I'm afraid. And it may even get worse in the event of renewed clashes between Israelis and Palestinians. So maybe I should also stop here and
we'll get back. I want to engage with you on some of those issues as we move forward. Thank you very much. Dr. Aksoy, how do you see, as an expert on Turkey's foreign policy in the region, how do you see this rapprochement, or this hopeful rapprochement that we're seeing today, how do you see that fitting in with Turkey's foreign policy in the region, in the Middle East, in North Africa? Is it part of an overall strategy? Should we look at it separately?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me for this wonderful event. And yeah, Ambassador, you already mentioned this is actually a part of the bigger game Ankara is playing, because we have seen that Ankara has shifted its policies. But it's also important, just take a step back and like from the meta level, look deeper into the matter, why Turkey shifts its policies now. I always say that the three dimensions are always important. The one is the international, the other one is the regional, and the third one is the domestic level of analysis. Is important to understand why Turkey is shifting its policies. The international level, as we all know, that the arrival of the Biden administration has changed the power dynamics in the region. And not only Turkey, but all regional powers began to readjust their foreign policies. And if you look at the last 1.5 to 2 years, we see the regional rivals appear to be willing to put aside their political differences and de-escalate long-standing tensions. And they really seek to develop better relations with each other. And Turkey is not an exception in that. And if you look what happened after the Biden administration came to power, this is like the US is negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran. Washington is also encouraging Iran-Saudi Arabia talk. The Gulf crisis between the Gulf countries and some of the Gulf countries versus Qatar has ended. So we see enormous change in the 1.5 years compared to the years before. This is the international level that the Biden administration era. The second level is the regional level. And I think all the regional powers have seen that the escalation is needed, and Turkey, especially Ankara, has seen that it has been left alone. It has been in isolation in the Middle East and North Africa, and Erdogan now embarks on efforts to revise its relations, and for that matter, Ankara, as we all know, started the rapprochement with Cairo, which is an important regional power. Israel, as we are witnessing today, United Arab Emirates as the new regional power, who is really started or began its own foreign policy, kind of also independently from the Saudi Arabia. So right now, Ankara, as we all remember, I'm sure Umut and Selin and Remy, it used to be no problems with neighbors policy in the first decade of the 2000s. But then after the Arab uprising, we have seen lots of problems with all neighbors. Now we hear a new term that has been used by the circles in Ankara, problemless circle. So Turkey wants to create a problemless circle, if we translate it, by normalizing its relations with the countries with which Ankara had hostility and or rivalry. And we must say, of course, Ankara benefits from the situation that all the regional powers are searching for a new race, and Ankara's efforts are received well in other capitals, but of course the doubts exist. And I think in this time, I mean, the doubt will remain among different actors. But what Turkey is very much interested in the region is that Turkey will continue to emphasize its national interest and leading to deeper economic, diplomatic, and defense cooperation. It brings me to the third level, the domestic level. As we all know, Turkey is experiencing economic crisis, and also due to that, social discontent. So Ankara, the government really needs kind of a support and foreign investment and that's why we have also seen that Erdogan has visited Dubai and Abu Dhabi and searching for resources to right the economic hardship. So if I want to close with an assumption that now we see that Turkey's foreign policy moves from an assertive and militaristic foreign policy into a more pragmatic and cooperative one. It's still very early, of course, to say, but I always say in my analysis, Erdogan is a very pragmatic leader, so he can change. That's why he has lots of U-turns. And in this context, I see Turkey, Israel, traditional, they view geopolitical trends and developments in the Middle East more or less in a similar way. And I think both attract a great importance to stability in Syria, and they both think that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. I think there are right now, and they prioritize, of course, the fight against terror. So there are lots of convergences between Israel and Turkey.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much. And I want to ask you some more about that in a moment, because I think you raised some very interesting issues. Remy, I'd like to ask you, there was a feeling here in Israel that the Israeli side was a bit hesitant and went very, very cautiously towards this visit, towards the possibility of a rapprochement with Turkey. Can you explain that? What are Israel's core interests? Were there specific requests that you understand that Jerusalem made of Ankara before this visit went ahead?
Yeah, you are completely right. And even looking at the way the Israeli media talked about the visit and the ceremony 1 hour ago was very interesting to see that on the one hand, Israeli media said it was an historic time, a historic event. On the other hand, there is some limited optimism and cautious optimism. Israeli President Herzog talked about that he will try to restart the relations, so the expectations are not very high, and it's linked to a few requests, or let's say a few problems in Turkish-Israeli relations that could be obstacles to a full rapprochement between the two countries. First of all, there is a problem of trust. Especially after 2016, when there was the normalization of the relations between Turkey and Israel, with the end of the cycle opened by the incident of the Mavi Marmara, which was ended by Israelis making important moves, steps towards the Turks. Benjamin Netanyahu called Erdogan to apologize about the incident. Israel accepted to pay retribution to the families of the Turkish citizens killed during the operation under Mavi Marmara. And the normalization that followed these important Israeli steps lasted for less than 2 years. It exploded following the Trump decision on Jerusalem. So there is this lack of trust and this idea in Jerusalem that it is not worth making too strong steps towards Turkey, because we don't know how long the positive impact of these steps may be, and how trustful the Turkish side can be. No, these more general remarks, I think there are 3 important issues that can be problematic for Israelis in their relations with Turks. First of all, and it has been mentioned by Dr. Nasi, the activities of Hamas in Turkey. It's a very complicated issue. It's linked both to the fact that Turkey has supported the Muslim Brotherhood in the region and has welcomed Hamas activists, but also Muslim members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey. It's also linked, by the way, to the Shalit agreement, when then Israel asked Turkey actually, that Turkey welcomed part of the Hamas terrorists freed as part of the Shalit agreements, but following all that, Turkey has become basically a basis for Hamas activities. We know that there are being attacks on Israel that were organized from Turkey, and that's a very sensitive issue for Israel. And there will be requests from the Israeli side that Turkey takes control on the activities of Hamas on its soil. I think the second issue is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very hot issue.
We're having trouble hearing you. Am I the only one having trouble hearing you, or other people as well?
No.
You are hearing him fine, everyone else?
No, I have also some trouble.
Oh, sorry. I will try. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Please start again with Jerusalem, please, Remy.
Is it better like that?
Yes.
Okay. So I will say that concerning Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a very important issue for the Turkish Islamic movement. Professor Umut Uzel wrote an article about that, the fact that already in the 1970s, 1980s, Jerusalem was a symbol for the Turkish Islamist movement. Erdogan in power has really taken the issue in his hands. He has organized a lot of events surrounding Jerusalem. He has made also important speeches. The one in 2020, very famously, he said that Jerusalem, and I quote, is our city, a city from us. The Turkish government has claimed an important role in the city and has also invested through the Turkish Development Agency money and efforts in the city. Of course, for Israelis, this is perceived as a factor for destabilization of an already tense city. So the Turkish activities around and in Jerusalem are a second point of tensions between the two countries. And the third, and it's linked also to this issue of Jerusalem, is the general tone of Turkey and the Turkish government concerning Jerusalem. It's linked also to what Celine Nassi said, the fact that Erdogan has allowed himself to be very, very aggressive and very, very aggressive on Israel. I would just quote that he compared Israel to the Nazi regime. He said that Israel was a terrorist state. He says that in domestic speeches, but also on international scenes at the UN, etc. So, of course, this is also a point that would be important for Israeli, having a Turkish government that has a more moderate tone when there are tensions between the two countries. On these 3 points, there are some positive points, but for example, on Jerusalem, even when we were in the middle of the preparations for the visit of Herzog in Ankara, the head of the Turkish parliament and Turkey's foreign minister both said that they won't make concessions on Jerusalem. So these are 3 important obstacles in the rapprochement between the two countries, but maybe also opportunities for Turkey to recreate maybe a better atmosphere for trust between the two countries.
Thank you very much, Remy. We'll get back to you shortly with some more questions. Can I return to Professor Uzer? You are the historical perspective, and I would ask you the following. If, and I don't want to see it, but if tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, there is a flare-up between Israelis and the Palestinians, we see another cycle of violence, does this automatically mean that Turkish-Israeli relations once again go in a very negative direction?
Short answer is yes. The Palestinian issue is the elephant in the room, and not only for the Islamists or the conservatives, but also for the leftists. And I thank Remy for quoting my article on the perception of the Islamists towards Palestine and Jerusalem in particular. But I also wrote last year about the socialists who went to the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. Their understanding was totally different. Oh, sure, there were a small group of people, but some of them later on became influential in media in Turkey. Their understanding of Palestine was also romantic as well. So there is a lot of sympathy. Okay, anecdotal evidence suggests sometimes when I ask people, the students or others, I mean, is Palestine really that important? Some of them say no. But when we look, Palestine is a source of mobilization for both left and the right. It seems quite important. So if there is another confrontation between Israel and the Palestinians. That is going to put a lot of pressure on the Turkish government. So, and that is the elephant in the room. But the problem is, I mean, how do you, if you index your bilateral relations on a third party, another conflict, that is problematic. So that is the situation, unfortunately, that will sort of poison or sort of influence the bilateral relationship between Turkey and Israel, particularly after Turkey has put so much investment. I'm not talking financial, but more say ideological or ideational investment in the Palestinian issue. There are civil society organizations promoting Jerusalem or Palestine, so that seems to be quite almost a national cause for Turkey at this point in time. But will that change? Is it possible to change? Maybe, you never know. I mean, of course, there's ideology on the one part and there's the pragmatism on the other side. Yes, pragmatism is important for Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, and for the Justice and Development Party. Look at the different coalition partners they had from back 20 years ago. They kept changing them. But there's also an ideological core, which I call the conservative narrative. And that is very important, and that is something we need to take into consideration because people believe in this. So that is going to be difficult, but we have to see what will happen. But the Palestine issue is definitely important for many, for both aisles in the ideological spectrum in contemporary Turkey.
So if you, Professor, were giving advice to the Israeli government, I mean, in this, at the INSS, if you say another war with Gaza is only a matter of time, I'm sure most of the senior scholars here would say, unfortunately, we don't want it, but unfortunately it probably is true. You would have to say, give advice saying that any progress we can make is only on very thin ice?
I mean, I am a little bit pessimistic because of that ideological, because of that framework that I'm offering. That's why my article's name was Downfall. But okay, can it rise up again? It can. But the Palestine issue is there, again, not only for a certain ideological sector, but for all, for most, or at least for the left as well. I mean, when you see big Jerusalem demonstrations, it's not only the government, but also the opposition also joins in. Mm-hmm. So that's not good news for the bilateral relationship. But as you know, we can be pragmatic sometimes in our personal lives, as well as the national life, in national life, or international relations rather. But this is a serious issue. I mean, this is a serious shadow of Palestine is there, no doubt.
Dr. Nasi, I'm not an expert like you. But there's been a theme over the last decade that every time there's a Turkish election, we see the Israel card played, and in a negative way. To what extent do you think that is inevitable next year?
No, I have a more clear answer. In general, foreign policy does not have much impact on voting behavior. It is the bread and butter issues which count most usually. And in Turkey's case, given the country's dire economic conditions, it is putting a lot of pressure on the government. Many blame the economic turmoil on the government's mismanagement. So they see it as a political problem, not only as an economic problem. They see it as a direct outcome of the presidential system, which has undermined state institutions, eroded meritocracy, and concentrated power in the hands of one person. So basically, in the upcoming elections, I consider economic indicators will determine the outcome. Still, from a larger perspective, foreign policy can indirectly help government have an impact on the elections. And I believe it is part of the plan. Because when you look at it, Ankara has been engaged in diplomatic overtures, as all the other experts have mentioned. And it is also pursuing a moderate foreign policy by trying to put relations back on track with the United States as well. So one of the main objectives of this policy reset is to overcome Turkey's regional isolation. Second, it wants to, as Aslı already mentioned, it wants to attract foreign investment, increase trade, tourism revenues, and if possible, explore energy cooperation. The political and the economic ones are in a way intertwined. You cannot expect investment when you are constantly quarreling with everyone, right? So reduced tensions in foreign policy would at least have a positive impact on the economy. I'm not saying, by the way, that foreign policy openings would cure Turkey's economic problems, because obviously they cannot. It cannot. But a political narrative based on Turkey's active engagement in diplomacy, so that it becomes an actor whose mediation is sought after, like it used to, may help the government. At the very least, they might be hoping that this narrative will resonate with the wider segments in the Turkish society.
But can playing the Israel card help energize the base of the party?
I am not as pessimist as Umut, by the way. I mean, if there is a tension in say, Jerusalem or between Hamas and Israel, it is certainly going to test the resolve of both sides. But we will check to see how the government is going to act. Is it going to undertake the responsibility of brokering a ceasefire, for example? Because, you know, Turkey has been left out of the frame for quite a while. Egypt and Qatar stole the scene. And they were at the forefront of any diplomatic initiative to mediate for a settlement. So maybe Turkey would try to, you know, take back, compensate its losses in this regard. We really need to see, because I know that there is much political will on Turkey's side this time around. So I see a greater potential for reconciliation to last longer compared to, say, in 2016.
I also remember personally that at the very beginning of the president's rule, when he was a prime minister at the very beginning, he said he wanted to play an active role in Middle East peace. I remember very distinctly. Thank you. Professor Skoy, tomorrow you are hosting in Turkey the foreign ministers of Russia and the Ukraine. And everyone is looking for this. And I was wondering, how do you see this crisis in the Ukraine and the crisis between the West and Russia? How is that affecting Turkey and the Middle East, if at all?
I mean, first of all, the question whether Turkey under Erdogan has changed its view of Israel and regional powers for strategic purposes, or whether it's merely repositioning itself tactically, becomes redundant if we consider the Ukrainian crisis, because we observe tectonic changes in the aftermath of 24th February. So, as I briefly explained earlier, after years of assertive politics in the region, Ankara changed its regional approach and seeking to improve its relations. And I think the prospect of Turkish relations with the West will also influence its approach toward the Middle East. So it is kind of, you know, like related to each other. The Ukrainian crisis will certainly accelerate the realignment and rapprochement attempts of Turkey with the West, because we see that Ankara, all the official statements kind of underline Turkey's NATO identity. Although we have been, I remember that we have been discussing and debating and asking, is Turkey a real NATO member, or how serious is NATO? So this assumption that, you know, like rapprochement attempts and the Ukrainian crisis will accelerate Turkey's you know, like relation with the West, or improve relations with the West, will probably being tested by all regional powers, because they're also considering their situation and their positioning. So the pace of the crisis, of the Ukrainian crisis, will at the same time determine Turkey's pace of the normalization efforts with the West. So they are very much related. And if you look now, where do Turkey and the West converge? We see Turkey was one of the earlier first countries provided Ukraine with arms and drones before many Western countries did, many European countries. Ankara began to use more and more the word instead of crisis, war and invasion. Ankara closed the straits according to the Montreux Agreement. Where they diverge is Turkey did not participate in the economic sanctions yet, and Turkey did not close its airspace. Because
like Israel.
There those both countries are converging actually, but Turkey's dependency is completely different than Europe. In energy issue, it's similar, as we all know. Turkey acquires 40 or 45% of its natural gas from Russia. and the tourists, like the tourism industry very much benefits from the Russian tourists as well as Ukrainian. So I was myself very surprised to see the Ukrainians were the second biggest tourist group in Turkey. I always thought it's Germans, but it's also one thing, and also the like the trade between Russia and Turkey. So Turkey has more vulnerabilities, considering also the economic crisis we all mentioned. And we will definitely also see Turkey's balancing act will reach its limit, while Russia is obviously seen as a biggest threat for the West, right? And Turkey, first of all, we have to remind it, is a NATO member. It's a candidate country of the EU, European Union candidate country. Ankara needs and willing to strengthen Turkey's NATO identity. And but if it will lead to cooperation, complete cooperation with the West, and remove the tension, we will see. I mean, it's still very early, but while Russia is excluded and marginalized in the international system, it's hard to maintain this balancing act. So Ankara will probably think of its economic bonds and national security interests in its policy towards the region. So that will possibly not change, because today I was reading what the head of the presidency of defense industries, which is under the umbrella of presidency under Erdogan, Ismail Demir, said, Turkey is surrounded, I quote, Turkey is surrounded by a ring of fire, cannot be foreign dependent. What he means is we should work on our technology, science and development on the ground. He means defense industry. So if we look at this quote, we can understand Ankara is very much concerned about the implications of the war on the security and the balance of power in its neighborhood. So we already have in the southern border the Syrian crisis. There are also quarrels in Iraq. Turkey is also included, of course, if you enlarge the region to North Africa and Libya. And Black Sea was a frozen conflict, but now we have fire in Black Sea and the South Caucasus, where both countries were, Russia and Turkey were supporting different partners. There also Israel and Turkey were also supporting Azerbaijan militarily. So and it also is afraid, Ankara is also afraid about the impact of this conflict on its already fragile economy. So I think the war in Ukraine is creating an added incentive for both Israel and Turkey to revisit their relationship, which the West, I think, the West as a concept is of course always blurred, but I think the US and the European powers should more actively support, because I think this is the moment. If we think of these tectonic changes after 24th of February, we see that the international system is changing. We already talked about it, but it has really accelerated. So it's an important moment. And I think Selin also said she's also more optimistic. I'm also, most of the time, I try to give the optimistic scenarios. Selin gave it from the domestic perspective. And I think for a region, although the militarization is really, it's another good sign, but it's a changing times, and Turkey and Israel as important powers in the region can align in their interests and needs.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to you on some of those points, because some of them I find particularly intriguing. Remy, in parallel to the crisis we've had in Turkish-Israel relations over the last decade, we've seen new energy in the relationship between Israel and Greece and Israel and Cyprus. I know when I was working in the Prime Minister's office, we would have very regular summits, both bilateral and trilateral. This is part of Israeli geopolitics. It's also part of the way we deal with the European Union by dealing with regional groups. To what extent do you think this rapprochement with Turkey affects those partnerships? Does it have to be one at the expense of the other?
The answer is quite complicated, because it depends from the countries. You mentioned Greece and Cyprus. In this case, it is sure that both in Athens and in Nicosia, the reactions to the possible rapprochement with Turkey are quite negative, and they were already negative in 2015 and 16, It is true that for the Greek government and the Republic of Cyprus, this rapprochement between Israel and Turkey is not something positive, but very interestingly, there have been great efforts from the Israeli side to reinsure Greece and Cyprus. Before going to Turkey, President Herzog was in Greece and in Cyprus. There was also a summit between the three countries in August with the Israeli Foreign Minister Lapid. So Israel has really made a lot of effort to reinsure its new partners in the region, as you mentioned it, Greece and Cyprus. Very interestingly, and it's also linked to so first.
We can't hear you again. We have to ask you to move closer.
I don't know why there are so many problems, but what I wanted to say is very interestingly, Greece and Cyprus are not the only new allies for Israel. There were also the Abraham agreements, and in this framework, there is more of similar policies. As Herzog mentioned, the rapprochement that is happening right now between Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. Then we saw a visit of Mohammed bin Zayed in Turkey, a visit of Erdogan in Abu Dhabi. So in this framework, Turkey, Israel, and the UAE have a similar policy, and it's also maybe now the time to mention also Iran. The three countries feel the same Iranian threat and want to act together more or less against this threat. So Israel's new allies do not have the same reaction to the rapprochement we are seeing. In the Gulf, this rapprochement is well perceived because Israel's new allies are also acting in the same way. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially Greece and Cyprus, their actions are opposite and quite badly perceived. But to finish this answer, I would also say that the existence of this new alliance in themselves influence the reaction of Israel from Israel to the Turkish seduction operation. Before, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Turkish relative value for Israel was much higher than it is now. It was one of the only Muslim countries with relations with Israel. It was an important economic partner. Now Israel has found new allies that fulfill the roles that Turkey used to fulfill before. So also the consciousness of Israel towards Ankara's new positive signs is also linked to the fact that Israel has now a much better geopolitical regional positioning that has lowered down Turkey's relative value in Israelis' eyes.
Interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. That's a very interesting point. Can I ask you though, Remy, does our relations with Cyprus and Greece give us more leverage when we deal with Ankara as Israelis?
I would not say that. It's a very complicated question. On one side, it is true that if you look in very realist terms, with Turkey on one side and Greece and Cyprus on the other, it is true that Turkey is a much stronger state. Even though there is an economic crisis, Turkey is a bigger economy, a stronger army. But, and that's exactly what you mentioned at the beginning of your question, Cyprus and Greece open to Israel a door to the European Union, also to the East Mediterranean Gas Forum that brings together a lot of countries, but not Turkey. So it is true that it is maybe not a leverage for Israelis in front of Turkey, but it has strengthened Israel in the balance of power against Turkey.
Thank you very much. Professor Uzer, you are the man who's written about the history, intellectual history of Turkish nationalism. I wanted to ask you, do you find a direct correlation between attitudes in Turkey towards Israel vis-a-vis attitudes to Turkey's larger orientation? In other words, if someone is pro-Western, they will necessarily be for a strong alliance with Israel. And if someone is more skeptical of Turkish relationship with the West, they will be more critical or standoffish towards Israel.
I think one point we're lacking in the bilateral relationship is that there are no natural allies that would support such a relationship. I mean, yes, there is the Jewish community, but it's quite limited. The numbers are declining. That's number one. I mean, when you compare it with the United States, you see the evangelicals. I mean, there's the Jewish community. Of course, it's not monolithic, but there's strong elements within that, like AIPAC and stuff like that. But also the evangelicals, so the Christians, whereas in Turkey, we don't have that. Back in the 90s, of course, it was the military and the foreign ministry that were really instrumental in improving the relations, and I think that worked quite well. Now the bureaucracies are not as bureaucracies are not as influential as they used to be, because there is a stronger presidential system. But interestingly, and I want to look at that too, what is the perception of the Islamist press, which is quite clear, obviously, but I also want to focus on the opposition towards Israel, like the newspaper Sözcü. We can call it as left Kemalist. I mean, their approach to Israel doesn't seem very positive either. I mean, today there was a column written there, and again, they just want to criticize the government, but that is not the point. The point is their approach to Israel is not that positive either. But we had certain individuals, like for the columnists of Hürriyet in the past, like Ertuğrul Özkök, he supported, I think, good relations, or former ambassadors to Israel like Namıktan, they did support her. So there is a certain element of support to improve the relations among the intellectuals and among the academics, as I previously said, but we're lacking a base to support this improved relationship between the two countries, I would argue.
So what is pushing us together today then, Professor? What is making today possible, in your opinion?
I think what has been mentioned, like it was mentioned that the leadership used to say that precious loneliness is a good thing. We realize it's not. What makes sense is there are serious national interests at stake, and I think Turkey and Israel are following very similar policies vis-a-vis the crisis in Ukraine. We're trying to keep a balance between Russia and Ukraine because we have important relationships, both Israel and Turkey. So I don't know if we will be able to do it, both countries, but that is right what we were trying to do, both Israel and Turkey. So it's, I think, going back to a more national interest-based foreign policy, whereas beforehand it was more emotional and ideological at one point in time. I'm not sure that's going to go away, as I said before, but staying in power is something that sort of motivates all governments, I think. And the Turkish government is very successful, having ruled the country for 20 years. They're very good at changing allies and internationally, and we have this background with Israel anyways in Turkey. But this feeling of isolation, I think, in the region and throughout the world, Turkey's prestige has declined drastically in the West, in Europe, and in the United States. Obviously, there's still some access to Russia and Ukraine, because there's going to be this diplomacy forum in Antalya tomorrow. For a few days. So that's important because the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine are coming. So Turkey's sort of influence in that region seems to be more important. But in the West, there's a serious lack of prestige in the past, 5-6 years, maybe even longer than that. But trying to break out this logjam is, I think, important, breaking the isolation, because that is what's happening. And it is, I think it's, a return. I don't know if it's going to last, but it's a return to a national interest-based, a realpolitik sort of foreign policy, which I've been suggesting, to all the people, because I mean it is important to follow the national interest. We didn't even hear the word national interest for many years because it was more emotional, really. But now I think it is definitely a national interest-based foreign policy, what Israel is doing towards Russia and Ukraine, and what Turkey is doing, and also towards each other, right? What Turkey and Israel are doing as well. I don't want to keep talking, but I want to say, I mean, back 20 years ago, I mean, the sympathy I experienced in Israel was quite interesting. So we had that, and whether it can come back, I'm not so sure, really.
Well, thank you for that. Dr. Nasi, you said in your introductory remarks, you spoke about anti-Semitism in Turkish society. And obviously in Israel, this is always a very sensitive issue. I know that when we look, say, at the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, at Hamas, their founding document is an openly anti-Semitic document. to what extent is this part of the narrative of the ruling party? To what extent, if people in the leadership today want to make a rapprochement, is this a problem for them? Does it put a clutter on their attempt to move forward? How important is this today in 2022?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, I believe there are people in the government and in Turkish society who have a negative attitude of Israel. I don't think they have changed their opinions, but politics is if you are a good politician, you need to be pragmatic. And I think our government and our president is a very pragmatic politician. So he knows when he should make a U-turn, and he is doing that. So I think today we should concentrate on the upsides of this reconciliation process. It's springtime. We shouldn't be overexcited, but we shouldn't underestimate the significance of this visit. It may well mark the beginning of a new era in bilateral relations. So I'm not saying that people have forgotten about what have been said. No, of course they will not. But we need to watch what will come afterwards. I mean, the outcome of this visit today depends on conditions and how events will unfold afterwards. Israel will of course check to see if Turkey will uphold its promises with regard to Hamas. In the press, there are claims that some steps have already been taken in this regard by Ankara. Israel will be checking to see if Ankara, keeps its promises. And on the other hand, as I said before, I'm not really pessimistic, but there might be some clashes because Ramadan is approaching, it's early April, and every Ramadan we witness escalation of tension in Jerusalem. Last year, Hamas used the tension in East Jerusalem to attack Israel. A possible escalation of tension would really test the strength of Turkish-Israeli reconciliation. But I cannot foresee how far the government will go in condemning Israel. It may well use this as an opportunity to rise to the occasion and find a settlement. So really, we need to focus on the upsides and wish for the well, because it will really contribute to the peace and stability in the region. And with regard to the Ukrainian war and the diplomatic initiatives both countries have been channeling their efforts into this, if they can pull it out, if parties reach a deal, it will not only be a tremendous success for the Ankara Diplomacy Forum, but it is going to be a good kickstart for Turkish-Israeli reconciliation, I believe.
Would you give me advice if I wanted to get an indication of where things are going now, Professor Nasi? Would you suggest that I read the newspapers that are so close to the president, and then I will get how they cover Israel? If I see a positive change there, that's a serious change. If I see no change there, I should be more cautious.
Well, first of all, I'm humbled by what you are saying. Thank you very much. You trust my expertise. I'm reading everything, but it takes time for me to distill and differentiate between which sources are more significant than others. Because if I only read pro-government newspapers, I end up with different opinions, and I only read liberal ones. I don't get the whole picture. And Galia is probably watching me right now.
Yes.
I gained so much. Yeah, I gained so much from our friendly conversations, because whenever a story hits the headlines, usually she is the one I turn to, and we exchange views, because she feels as perplexed as I do in these times when the media amplifies the stories and the developments. Even a tiny gesture is considered a breakthrough. And we are trying to, help each other out in understanding what is really going on, and asking how news is echoed on the Israeli side. I mean, she's a great friend of mine and an esteemed colleague, and I cannot thank her enough in clarifying the picture for me. Well, this is what I do, and you have it with you in INSS, so you're so lucky.
No, we thank every day that she is with us on our team. Dr. Aksoy, you spoke before about a convergence in Israeli-Turkish relations when it comes to Russia, which is interesting, both sides wanting to part of the West and at the same time open channels to Putin and wanting to mediate if we can. My Prime Minister already mediated, you are mediating tomorrow. Is there also a convergence on Syria?
I think yes. Again, the point is Russia. So Turkey's presence in Syria should be aligned with Russia, because Turkey has had this invasion in different parts of Russia with the permission of in the different parts of Syria with the permission of Russia and the US. And in Idlib, there is this deal between Russia and Turkey that Turkey should take care of I put that in quotation mark, of course, take care of the jihadists and seal the deal, like alongside of the M4 highway, and then they cooperate. If the things got worse, it will create a problem, huge problem for Turkey. I start with not only with economics, security, migration, which will also immediately have an impact on European security. And Israel, more than I do, Israel also needs Russia to hit the targets in Syria with the groups that are aligned with Hamas and Iran. So I think this is the way where, their security concerns and their cooperation with Russia is the point where there is a convergence. But of course, Israel is much more interested in southern Syria, and Turkey is much more interested in northern Syria. And when I was visiting INSS in October, November, I was also talking with other colleagues. And of course, there is also how does Israel sees, Kurdish autonomy and so. So I get different kinds of answers that I will not open it here because we don't have that much time. But I don't think that that's an issue that will create a problem between both states, between Israel and Turkey.
Thank you very much. Look, we're running out of time, and I apologize. So, Remy, I'm going to ask you a complex question, and you will give me a yes or no answer. Are you optimistic, Remy, that we're going to go from here to a rapprochement, and that Israel's relationship with Turkey will, in the coming months and years, be substantially better than what we've seen so far?
I will not answer your question, but I will say something close to that. Because in Israel, we have this obsession with Erdogan as a negative figure, and we focus on him a lot, and he's an issue of public debate in a very obsessive way. And I think that what this also discussion has shown is that maybe he may be the only one in Turkey able to improve the relations with Israel, between Turkey and Israel. He is the only one in Turkey with enough pragmatic views and also the capacity to mobilize his own base, like other leaders, Israel, we know also that, behind him. So maybe this is a unique window of opportunity between Israel and Turkey, because the Turkish leader that is so hated in Israel may be the key to a rapprochement between the two countries.
What you're telling me, Remy, is just as Ariel Sharon was the only one who could pull out of Gaza, you're saying that he's the only one that can lead the rapprochement with Israel.
Exactly.
The history is a mystery.
Can I thank all of you so much for what I think was it was interesting for me. I hope it was interesting for you. I hope it was interesting for everybody watching. Professor, doctors, Remy, thank you so much for participating. We are now going to take a brief break because we have to set up for the next session. Please, everyone watching, stay watching. The break will be brief, and we're coming back for the next session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
I have a tiny clue.
Thank you, Ambassador Regev, and all the wonderful speakers in the first panel. We move now to a panel on the economic and energy dimensions of Turkey-Israel relations. Throughout the past decade, the only area which seemed to be less affected from the political crisis was the economic dimension. Almost in a linear manner, the trade volume continued to grow. In fact, 2021 was a record year in mutual trade, and the trade volume reached, now according to Israeli statistics, $7 billion, and according to Turkish statistics, which are more optimistic, $8 billion, making Turkey and Israel important trade partners for each other. With regard to energy, we know that in the process that led to the 2016 normalization agreement between Israel and Turkey, there were talks between the sides about export of natural gas from Israel to Turkey. These talks did not end in an agreement, but in a statement from early February, President Erdogan raised again the possibility of gas exports from Israel. To discuss these issues, we are joined by two prominent speakers. Beside me, Ambassador Dr. Erdogan and Dr. Ytzhak. Let me briefly introduce them. Ambassador Dr. Erdogan is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Among his various distinguished positions, he served as Israel's ambassador to the EU, covering NATO as well. And he was Israel's ambassador to Jordan and head of Israel's negotiation team with the Palestinians from 1999 to 2000. Dr. Ytzhak is currently Director of Area Studies Program at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, known as TEPAV, and President CEO of TEPAV Global, Washington, D.C. Previously, he was a faculty member of the Department of Public Finance at Ankara University and an external founding member of the Monetary Policy Council of the Central Bank of Turkey. In 2006, he transferred to the newly established Tov University of Economics and Technology. He was the founding managing director of TEPAV in 2004, which is the first and only economic policy think tank in Turkey. So let me start with you, Ambassador Erdogan. Do you think that the disputes among regional actors over gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean also made the crisis between Israel and Turkey worse?
I do think so, because the cooperation between Israel and Turkey, the potential in it could be very positively influencing their relations. But the lack of the cooperation in natural gas and other regional economic possibilities reduce the potential for improving relations. There are, for example, the dispute between Israel and Lebanon. It is wider than the dispute over the demarcation of the exclusive economic zone between the two countries. But that in itself, this dispute, reduces the possibility, the feasibility of a pipeline which takes the gas from the East Mediterranean to the web of pipelines in Turkey and from there to Europe. The dispute between Cyprus and Turkey is another example that even if we could cooperate with Lebanon, then comes the question, how do we pass the pipeline through the EEZ of Cyprus and the whole question of northern Cyprus involved in this. The disputes between Egypt and Turkey over the demarcation between Libya and Turkey of the EEZ is another layer in the tension in the East Mediterranean, which makes the cooperation between Israel and Turkey more difficult than just the bilateral aspect of it.
Thank you. Dr. Ytzhak, I'll move to you. Do you think the economic crisis Turkey is currently undergoing through pushed it to get closer to Israel? And I think the first panel touched upon this issue also.
Oh yeah. Hello. Let me just say that, you know, the economic problems that we have in Turkey is our own making, basically. So I think, first of all, the solution to the issues that we have, because when you look at the Turkish economic performance in the last 2 or 3 years, during and after the pandemic, I think we made a significant, very quick recovery after the pandemic, if you look from 2019 to 2021, both in terms of exports, export capacity of the Turkish economy, and also the growth performance of the Turkish economy. But this happened despite the currency crisis that we have, despite the exchange rate depreciation, despite highly indebted companies in the country. So we have some problems, but I don't think that this opening is solely related with the economic problems that the country already has. I mean, I certainly believe that, you know, we have two countries, and we are talking about Israel and Turkey, that are both market economies in this region. That's why, as you have just mentioned, the export figures, I mean, the economic relations or the current economic relations between Israel and Turkey is continuing despite difficulties between the two capitals. The economic activity is still continuing. And also we have two industrial countries in the region. But I don't think the current opening, the current rapprochement process is totally only related with the economy. It's kind of, you know, if you look at the other things that are happening around this President Herzog's visit to Ankara nowadays, you know, Turkey, in fact, is trying to come in from the cold, which is good. Talking is good. Not talking is bad. So I think rebuilding old relationships in the region is a positive issue. Besides the economic issues, there is some potential that we can discuss. But I think this is not solely about the economy.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. We can't ignore the situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. I want to ask you, Ambassador Iran, after the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 project, do you see greater chances for cooperation between Israel and Turkey in the export of natural gas?
This is a very important question, because the situation around the Ukraine, especially in the natural gas and other resources, really resuscitates the whole option of other sources for Europe. But we have to be very careful. Number one, the whole East Mediterranean basin cannot be compared in terms of quantities to the Russian source. With all due respect to Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, we have natural gas, but not in the quantities consumed by Europe. We can alleviate some of the problems, but here comes the problem of the years wasted by not creating an alternative through Turkey, from Israel, Egypt, and the fact that Lebanon even didn't start to extract the natural gas. So the option is reopened for Turkey and Israel and other countries in the East Mediterranean, but it's not an immediate one, in the sense that we don't have a pipeline and we don't have installations in Israel to liquefy the gas, and Turkey doesn't have the other installations which are necessary for accepting liquefied gas, LNG. So the option is open, but it's not immediate.
Thank you. Dr. Sak, Israel's imports from Turkey from Turkey in 2021 amounted to $5 billion. Do you see potential for further growth in trade ties, or have we reached a ceiling? And what about experts from Israel? Where do you see potential for new directions?
I also said a few things about this East-Med situation regarding the questions that you have asked to the Mr. Ambassador. Galia?
Yes, of course, please.
Huh? Okay.
Yes, of course, please.
Let me start from there, because I think for your first question to the ambassador, I think the anti-Turkey alliance in the East-Med was bad for Israeli-Turkey relations. I mean, East-Med Energy Forum was a very good idea, but having that without Turkey, I think, turned that into a joke. So I think that's one thing that deteriorated the relations, but also it's not only rests on Israel. There are issues on our side too regarding that, but that may require a longer time. I think there are two issues when it comes to thinking about the Israeli-Turkey relations from now on. There are two game changers that I'm seeing. One is the Green Deal that's going to reshape the geopolitical situation, the economic situation all around the world, and also in our region too at the same time, because this is kind of a technological renovation that's going to be needed for everywhere. And I think regarding that, I had this idea of, the major problem with Israeli-Turkey economic relations up until now is related with the depth of the relations. We couldn't deepen the relation by kind of cooperation between our companies, doing work together, because it's not understandable for Turkish companies to go to US and to other places for, looking for technological renovation, for the new techniques, etc. Israel is already here, and there is the potential in Israel. There is the potential for partnerships with the Israeli companies, but I think we lost that trust all over these, the last since 2007, 2008. We lost that trust. I think this is a good opportunity because this Green Deal issue requires a capital-intensive economic transformation, technological renovation in all the sectors, and I think that I see huge potential for cooperation. And I think the second game changer that is now happening, we'll see how big a game changer that is the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I mean, in both Tel Aviv and in Ankara, we don't talk too much about, against, we don't raise our voices, let me say, but we are, I think it needs to be considered that if the objective at the end of the day is to de-weaponize Russia by doing something for some kind of sanctions on oil and gas and other things, in this interim period, in this transition period of the Green Deal, then I think having a bankable project regarding this, the East Mediterranean gas could again become a possibility. I mean, because when this Russian operation has started, I had this first notion that, it's going to take days. Now it is weeks. If it's going to be months, and if it's going to be a few quarters, then all such kind of projects, I think, are going to become more and more important, that may open new possibilities, because in Europe is going to be dependent. They are looking for opportunities for green hydrogen imports in the future, and that requires some natural gas also to go together with the green hydrogen. So there may be new opportunities for cooperation, and I think it's in the high-tech area, mostly in this technological renovation area. I think it is in the area of partnerships with Turkish and Israeli firms. If we can, build up this trust thing as quickly as possible, I think there will be many openings.
Thank you. Dr. Ivan, you also worked a lot about projects for renewable energy in the region. How do you see Turkey involved in such projects?
I take it from where Dr. Sak finished his response now, and I would say that we have now a window of 30 to 40 years for the existing resources of energy. Then the window shuts down according to the international concept of how soon we move to the green revolution. This is very important in terms of, as you said, Dr. Sack, the bankability or the financial feasibility of certain projects, because every investor will look at how soon he can return the investment on pipelines, on installations, liquefying, deliquefying of gas, etc. I would say that one possibility, which, and I regret that the European Union sort of abandoned it in the recent months, and that is the solar electricity line around the Mediterranean, because I think that Turkey then becomes a very important hub and link in this pipeline connecting the Middle East with which is the natural place to install all the solar energy production, solar electricity production, and therefore it would be very important if Turkey, Israel, other South Mediterranean countries could combine to come with some sort of a cooperation project to the EU and revive the idea. I think that the whole question of the combination, which Dr. Sack referred to, natural gas, hydrogen, is another field which will certainly be a very important key in the bridge between the current situation and the move to green, totally green resources or renewables. And so in terms of the cooperation in the next 3 decades, 4 decades, it is, the work is we can look at certain ideas as the building blocks for cooperation between Israel and Turkey, and not only the two of them, but the adjacent neighboring countries.
Right. I totally agree with you, Mr. Ambassador. I see a great potential.
This is good news in my view, that there's potential for cooperation on renewables. And I want to take you, Dr. Sack, I didn't mention it in the opening remarks while presenting you, but you were also the coordinator of the Ankara Forum activities, which was a 3-party gathering of Turkish, Israeli, and Palestinian businessmen and government officials in the past. So I want to ask you, what role can Turkey have today in improving the economic situation of the Palestinians?
Yeah, I first came to Israel, I think, when Ariel Sharon was disengaging from Gaza. So, and it was the idea of late Shimon Peres, I have to say, looking for possibilities for, a tripartite framework. And I have to say that, our project, after the Ankara Forum process, we had chosen an industrial estate project, and it didn't die. Let me tell you about that. Because after the Hamas takeover in Gaza, we left Gaza, and I started looking for a project place, because that was our idea, bringing Israeli, Palestinian companies together in a border estate. That was the objective. That was the, culmination point of our discussions within the Ankara Forum. So we started looking for, because we have a company now, it's called Tobbis. we first started looking for places in the south. Then we have decided to move to Jenin because there was already an old German project, their industrial estate project. So we invested some money over there, and now together with KfW in our land, let's say the border estate, we now have electricity and water treatment facilities, and about I think after about in 6 months, I think we'll take over the land and start an activity, some building activity over there, and hopefully at the beginning of next year we may have an industrial estate and start its operation. So the project that we have decided during the Ankara Forum is still continuing. We have a company that is registered both in Turkey and in Palestine, in PA now, by the PA now, but in Ramallah. But now we are going to register the company in Israel too, to make all the logistics easier. So the project that we have, the industrial estate, and then we'll start bringing companies to the area. I think it's still alive, and we are still working on the old project. It looks viable.
Wonderful. We talked about the Palestinian, and there's one organization which was the Palestinian Authority and Israel are in, which is the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, but Turkey is not inside. Yeah. So I want to ask you, Ambassador Iran, do you think the East Med Gas Forum can be more inclusive, both in terms of who is inside the forum, and also more inclusive in terms of what topics it deals with? I mean, not only gas, but also, as we talked earlier, about renewables?
I think that I sort of refer to the addition that you added, Dr. Sack, earlier in the discussion. And I want to say that, yes, Turkey is not a member, but it's not a decision that is in the hands of Israel, in the sense that basically it belongs to the whole question belongs to the historical current rivalry between Greece and Cyprus on the one hand and Turkey on the other. From the real professional point of view, purely the economic point of view, it would have made great sense to have Turkey a member if we deal only with natural gas cooperation and other areas of cooperation in the East Mediterranean. But it is, as I said, it's not for Jordan, which is a member in this forum, not for Egypt, not for Israel, to solve the Greek-Turkish disputes and conflict. I think that, I hope that the visit of our president is just a small part in the change, a strategic change in Turkey, which eventually may result in a greater, at least economic cooperation between the various and all of the neighbors to the East Mediterranean basin.
Let me add to your hope that in a few days we'll also see the Greek Prime Minister coming to Ankara, so maybe there is something being cooked in the region.
Let me add one thing regarding that. I agree. I agree. The Cyprus problem, Cyprus issue, the relations between Turkey and Greece has also been prevented, our EU process too, at the same time. But nowadays, I'm also hearing better sound voices, let's say, from the President Anastasiadis' side. So maybe we can see some openings regarding that too, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Because especially after this, the Russian thing, we need to rethink all the old positions. This is a major game changer, I think.
Fully agreed.
These are wonderful news. We're approaching our end, so I want to do with you a lightning round. You both have been following Turkish-Israeli relations for many years. how do you view the current rapprochement? What are the chances of success? We'll start with you, Dr. Sak.
No. I think there is a chance of success. There is a great chance of success. At the outset, I said that talking is good, better than not talking. Let me rephrase that. Talking openly is better than, talking behind the doors. In the case of Israel and Turkey, I think talking openly can pave the way for a better basis for our relationship, because I think we need to work together. There's no question about that. Two market economies in the region, two industrial countries in the region. We have a lot to do in this whole Green Deal process is going to bring important geopolitical changes also in the region. So it's better to work on that economic transformation throughout all this region together. I think it is. I see this as a great opportunity. Let me say it that way.
Ambassador Iran, your final words?
Several things have happened in the recent decade. The Arab Spring, Corona, the Abraham Accords, at least the impression that the United States is withdrawing from the region. What it means to the region is that we need to increase the cooperation, get rid as much as we can from old historical disputes which prevent this cooperation. I think that both in Ankara and in Jerusalem, there is a reassessment of our regional policies in light of the developments which I mentioned, including the Abraham Accords between Israel and some Arab states. And all of these open new doors for cooperation and for the benefit of all involved in the region. Thank you.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sak. Thank you, Ambassador Iran, for your very insightful remarks. I hope this optimism that is coming out of this panel will also be matched by optimism from these very exciting pictures coming out of Ankara from the visit of the President Herzog in his meeting with President Erdogan. So thank you very much.